Yeah, well, maybe it's just ingrained in you when you're born in an area which has got an enormous football club around it, 2 blocks from Adelaide and AFL. Part of it's part of your life cycle, isn't it? I mean, I remember my Saturday mornings were very, very clear. It was the days of 12 o'clock close for shops and so forth. So there was the rush to do everything around Black Diamond Corner. Then you'd go home lunch, and then it was Albert and Oval. It was as simple as that. And when you've got football as big as it was, late 60s, early 70s, big football club around you, yeah, that's it. Becomes ingrained, doesn't it?
So did that give the urge to kick a footy, being amongst it?
Yeah, that happened at school anyway. You're in a small school with a lot of playgrounds, and there's just a football. So yeah, that's inevitable as well. So yeah, it was simple, it was slower, and it maybe was even better. Yeah, but that was it. It was part of the way in which you grew up around a community. Probably something we've lost today, in the sense of Australian football, when it's a national competition known as the AFL, there's a national draft which sort of ends that dream, that one that we always just talk about, the kid who grew up in a local district would hang off the fence at club training, would dream of wearing the local team's colours. That community system of where then we had these tribal moments through Adelaide and the SANFL. So, yeah, simple, slower, better. And probably we achieved more by being slower. There was an interesting period of where school sport was changing a lot, whether it be because of lack of volunteers, whether the teachers were no longer feeling that was part of their role, and then a whole change of the way in which things were done. I mean, I can remember I lived through that era where goalposts were starting to disappear at school grounds. So that organised football that was at Alberton and Woodville before me was sort of disappearing. And probably you look at it, you look at Woodville High, they had strong volunteers who kept school sport going. And by the time I'm getting there, they're disappearing. So yeah, it wasn't as strong as it had been before I'd arrived, sadly. Yeah, I mean, we would play it through our recesses and lunchtimes, but there wasn't any more an organised football team anymore. We'd lost that, sadly. It wasn't like I lived all those stories of, Jeff Motley and that crew of Port Adelaide boys who went to Woodville High, would play Saturday morning and then go and play Port Adelaide Colts, or in his case even league. That had gone by the time I'd reached Woodville High in the mid to late 70s, sadly. It's the ultimate dream. League football for your local football club. When it's Port Adelaide, it's even a bigger dream. Didn't happen. Simple as that. Growing up, not seeing that success crystallise in grand finals, even though they made it. The 2 losses to North, the ones to Sturt, the one that always sort of leaves a scar is the 76 one to Sturt. And then don't lose a grand final after that under the Kale era. So, and then get to the AFL because of it, all that ambition and want that Port Adelaide wants to be. So yeah, it was sport, absolutely. What stands out about John was his ability to motivate, and an enormous motivator, great motivator. To watch, in particular listen, his ability to give players belief that they didn't have, his just little verbal messages that he, particularly as he'd walk around a change room before a game, to just inspire people to be better than they were, to tell them that they could do things that they probably didn't even have in mind themselves. So that's this outstanding memory of him. He was just an enormous motivator of men who could make a group of 20 guys come into a change room. Already they had their own motivation as to what they wanted to do, but he crystallised it in a way which was just so powerful. It was evident, 10 premierships. Oh, that's the Russell Ebert era. I mean, you couldn't help but love Russell Ebert for the way in which he just could dominate a football game, but also the way in which he was he was just so strong in his own mindset. Classic player, and then you get to learn who Russell Ebert is. And everyone will tell you he's the true gentleman that he was. And the stories that aren't told about Russell, about the way he would go out of his way to help people, just because that line that he always had, that whatever you walk past was the standard you were accepting. So he just wasn't going to walk past what he would consider an injustice or something that was wrong. He was going to fix it and never ask for anything back. I mean, if you asked for Russell for a favour, it was done before you even knew it was done sometimes, and not seeking anything in return. My earliest memories, and this is about a Port Adelaide that's lost, or a football era that's lost, was those Saturdays where lunch at home after we'd do the rush around of everything along Black Diamond Corner. Dad taking me to the footy at Adelaide and AFL. And I still have these vivid memories of half time, this great rush to all these black cabs that were lined up on Braun Place. And we'd just rush everyone to the Alberton Hotel where all the beers were lined up. And then they would all come back for the third quarter. And then you reach a point where you're your own age, you've got your own mates. And it's not only just about home games at Alberton, it's home and away. So, yeah, look, that was it. Every Saturday was a Port Adelaide game somewhere. And then it does change for me personally, is when we get Sunday footy at Footy Park, which is not far from where I was living at Alberton. And you didn't mind wanting to go see another game, a couple of other teams. Not that many of my mates wanted to do so, but I didn't mind actually going to watch other teams play. Yeah, and I went to Adelaide University, which was more probably other people's dreams in my life. My father in particular felt that, I should have a university education because he was denied one. An immigrant, lived through the war, just didn't have the chance. He was a smarter man than I, probably would have done better at university than I. So I'm not saying that in the end I was living his dream, but I was probably, they felt that was, my mum and dad felt that was the best way to progress. You had to have the best education possible and then have the best opportunities in life. That was their wish for their children. So, I went to Adelaide Uni for 3 years, get a Bachelor of Science degree, and it hangs up on a wall. The science degree had majors in accountancy and computer science, so it was designed more to be someone who would leave university to work in the financial sector. That was where the end game was. It never happened. That never happened either. It was a destiny or opportunity created something else. It probably lights a fire, doesn't it? Because there were all the little small things I was doing, whether it was Messenger Press, Footy Budget, Port Adelaide with its Magpie News. And then Footy Times as well. That was huge along the progress to getting to the Advertiser. It became something that lit a fire. That's as simple as that. It was probably something within me that said, you could write, you could put words together. You love the game of footy. Here's a way to actually do it together. Write, do football, and find an existence through that. I can remember when I saw the ad that was placed in the Tiser for when they had cadetships, real cadetships. And I looked at it and I thought, do I actually apply for this? What's this going to mean? Because I was already going down a different path. I got in there, and as they say, the rest is history. Well, that as I say, was a true cadetship. I was lucky as a university graduate that I was only going to do 1 year as a cadet, but you were going to do all the rounds of the kitchen. And this was still the era of where you typed up the television listings, the shipping, the weather. But I got very, very lucky in that even before I got to the sports department, there was a connection with the guys who were in there. Gordon Schwartz, Merv Agar's, Jeff Kingston. Mike Howard was just leaving then to go and become a national and international star. And the luck that I had, or the blessing was that Merv Agar's was going to keep me in sport, was going to argue to keep me in the sporting department. So I don't think I did the 4 rounds of the kitchen then, because by the time I got to the sports department, which I think was those times you had about 3 months in each section, I didn't leave. You know, he kept me in there, thankfully. Oh no, again, when you start, you're doing everything, including typing up the famous Cooper's Guide that used to be there on the Saturday morning, and having to be aware of all the smart alecks that were in that sports department, like the famous Dennis Brown, who would tell every young cadet when they were doing the trotting, Globe Derby, and he would suddenly slip in every so often, bring your own bucket and spade. And when you'd say, Dennis, why do they need a bucket and spade? Oh, well, there's been some work done on the track and they need everyone to come along and help. Eventually, one time it actually did get in there. One cadet did fall for the gag. Oh, the most powerful rider was Jeff Kingston. Jeff had... it's an era of where sports writing's being challenged by live television. An increasing amount of sport on television, and then radio as well. The way in which it changes with Ken Cunningham on radio. So we're seeing that era of where every announcement, every statement would be made in print. Had to be a press statement. And inevitably people would say, yeah, but we would issue a statement and find it would be either edited or whatever in print. And that was the right of any writer and any editor to say, well, you know, we're not falling for the spin here, we're going to work the story. The beauty of live radio, particularly the way that Ken Cunningham would do it, was there was no edit, it was live. What you were saying, you got your message. Now, if you were good enough to relay your message, fine. But you also knew Ken was going to ask some questions, so you need to be able to then get through the hurdles. So it's changing. And we're getting more and more SANFL on television. So the routine virtually was a game on a Saturday, the advertiser writers on the Sunday doing their review of it. And as a kid, I can remember getting on any train, any bus in that era, and everyone was struggling with a big tabloid newspaper folding up. But you knew on Monday, they were turning to the sports section. They were looking at those reviews of those 5 games that were played on the weekend, looking at the best players, who had got the 3-2-1, etc. That's going. It's slowly disappearing to what was happening with those football shows on a Sunday. So if you were going to write something of a game that was played probably 48 to 72 hours before someone's reading it, you needed to be very clever with your writing. So Jeff's the one who's going down that path. Jeff Kingston could actually see, well, if someone was going to spend their time and money on a Monday morning to read about a game that was played on a Saturday afternoon, have to deliver something more than just Port Adelaide defeated North Adelaide by 42 points at Prospect Oval on Saturday afternoon, stop New Par. Much different. So he's the one I can remember as beginning to change the way we were writing. But in terms of who was powerful on it, Merv Agarth was the most enormous sports editor you could ever know. Knowledge of sport, decency, understanding what the man and woman on the street was wanting to read. So yeah, they're the 2 figures that stand out. But everyone in that sports department has a strong memory in my mind. Gordon Schwartz with his... Gordon was just the man of pure perfection. Like everything he did was perfect and decent too. The biggest one who I would have to have worked to would have been Ray Titus. Leaves the news because that closes down, finds his way to the advertiser, and his connection with sporting people in Adelaide was just enormous, just an enormous profile. But with Ray, there was the great understanding that with pictures, even though they told 1,000 words, there had to be some words around them. And he knew how to, put together a photograph with a journalist to then get a photograph and a story in the paper. So yeah, he was pretty big in that space. By the 80s, you had no choice. So you're looking at an era where we're beginning to see the start of news emerging elsewhere. So bear in mind, through the previous century, people were having a newspaper land on their lawn or picking it up, at the news seller on the corner. And that was not just morning, but afternoons. That was basically where they were getting their sport news, or probably news all round. But we're slowly seeing times change. More television space, more radio space. There's no point in sitting behind a typewriter or then a laptop or even now whatever device you're using, and your first 10 to 15 words are going to be any description of something they already know. Like I said earlier, what's the point of by Monday morning telling someone Port Adelaide defeated North Adelaide by 42 points at Prospect Oval? They know that. They've probably seen the big replay with Mike Coward at Channel 7. They've seen the footy inquest with Ken Cunningham and Neil Curley and the gang on Sunday afternoon. Why are you telling them something they already know? You've actually got to find a way to actually present an image of what happened at a footy game, or what's happening in football, what's happening in sport, that makes them think, oh, there's a bit more to this. Des Flavell, when he was at Channel 9, had that saying, it's more than just the score. There is a story behind every scoreline. So tell the story. I tend to think there was an era of where there was a lot of change at the Tizer, and some people got out. I mean, I still can't get over how Brian Charlton one day decided he just wasn't going to work there because of the new regime. Now, this is where it goes from being a long-established newspaper in Adelaide to being part of the Murdoch empire. And Brian says he's not part of that. And I'm at that point where I'm beginning to wonder whether I wanted to be part of it as well and looking at opportunities in Europe. And I was off the chance to go to New York to work in their bureau there. And that was that. 5 years, different existence, different. It was back to almost going back to the cadetship days where you're going to do the whole rounds of the kitchen. But I did get lucky to go to a lot of big-time sporting events and see how the Americans were probably a decade ahead of what we were facing in how to change the description of sport in print. They had much more television than we ever had here in Australia. So you just found there were great writers there who could tell the story rather than just tell you the result. I was just frustrated with the notion that we had a great Australian game that wasn't national. And I was becoming as frustrated as many that we were digging in on political issues as to why we were going to be still a state-based competition rather than putting our hand up and being part of, I know it was an expanding VFL, but part of a genuine national competition. I felt we needed to be part of it rather than be on the outside trying to change it. So look, it wasn't like as if something was being taken away from me. It was something I thought, well, it's still going to be there. Maybe there's something else to go see as well. And I'm glad I did that for that reason. It's funny how when you grow up in a really intense football environment that Adelaide was, and you're told it's the greatest game in the world, and I'm not disputing, it is a great game, but it's almost like you're told everything else is inferior, or that the Americans are obsessed with statistics. I go, really? They're obsessed with statistics? And we looked at ourselves just recently. So a game like baseball, which didn't have a great storyline or presence. I mean, I know there was the Claxton Shield and so forth, but it wasn't huge as it is when you go to the heart of the US. But it wasn't just the game that gave me an eye-opening experience of just how different sport could be in other parts of the world. It was the way in which they just love the history of the sport. And I could watch Ken Burns' documentary on baseball day after day after day, for the way he tells the story of how a game is not only part of a sporting cycle, but part of a nation's growth. So you just learn that there's more to life than just Australian football. While it's been part of your upbringing, it's great to go somewhere else and see what sport is like somewhere else and how the importance that Australian football has to us here, because we grow up with it, has a completely equal derivative somewhere else. There is another sport somewhere else that is just important to some other people. And you get it, fall in love also with the way in which they do it. Yeah, and at the time that I was there, they weren't having a great time as Yankees and Mets. I was there in the era where the Mets put together the biggest payroll in Major League Baseball and finished last. So the Yankees didn't win a World Series, and I was delighted for that. Yeah. But I also got to see a lot of, international sport, whether it be through golfing events or tennis events. So yeah, it was luckiest 5 years that I've had. I mean, I grew up in an environment where you just had a lot of space. This was tight. This was everyone on top of each other. I can understand why Central Park is so loved, because you finally get some green space. It's just look, I was brought up, if you went to the newsstand like I did and asked for something, you'd say please and thank you. The guy behind the counter thought I was taking the mickey out of him by saying please and thank you. So it's a different world. Probably not my world. So I enjoyed every opportunity to get out of there as well. So yeah, it's a great city, one I haven't visited again, not because I don't want to. I'm sure I want to visit it, but it was tough to live in it, particularly when you grew up in Adelaide. I was lucky that in that time in the US that I got to do the 1990 World Cup finals in Italy. And that was where I had the opportunity then to spend a bit of time at the end looking at what was a small family estate that was left to my father, and he decided he didn't want to deal with it anymore. He was going to sell it actually in '83. Came back having changed his mind, and then it was my opportunity to actually redevelop what was there, rebuild an old barn and turn it into a house, and then just found that's where I enjoyed living. So look, from '93 onwards, it was a simple existence. Simple in design. It was spend 9 months of the year in Australia with what was becoming a bigger and bigger AFL in Adelaide. 3 months enjoying life in Europe. And now it's probably going to flip the other way eventually. Yeah, Jeff Roach rang me at the time when I was deciding whether I was going to return to Australia or live in Europe. He said, look, I've got a job for you. And it was virtually like, I've got a job for you Monday. I'm going, Jeff, I've got a few things on. So he was good enough to give me, trying to remember now how much time I did take off to, but yeah, I did return in '93 when it was getting pretty interesting. Like Adelaide's on the way to its first final series. We're just about to find out where a second licence will develop. Came back to some of the biggest stories that we had in an AFL cycle in Adelaide. I was away. I wouldn't say I missed it though, but I was away and I was observing from afar. Yeah, it's the big story of that time. Probably the biggest story that we can put when you do a list of big stories in South Australian football. It's probably going to be either number one or close to the top. Changes everything. And you're always going to still find people who are going to debate as to who was right and who was wrong and who did what and who didn't do this and who did do this. So yeah. Yeah, it was interesting that by the time I came back, there were more and more people being quoted there were just a lot more quotes emerging. Like previews of footy games before I left were just someone's opinion as how it was going to play out, what was going to be the great matchup. And by the time I came back, it was more about the actual competitors and the participants talking about what was going to happen. So that's one of the big changes. But everything that was obvious from before, that television was going to change the way in which sport was presented, was more and more obvious, which was going to challenge print far more than ever before. So, yeah, you trying to remember. I'm still trying to remember, when was the very first sports segment on a TV news service? So now you've got people, and I think the numbers were enormous, were they? Around the early 90s, you get 400,000 people watching a 6 o'clock news service. That's a lot of people suddenly at 6:20 hearing, Mark Rasciuto's done a hamstring at Crows training. That's not going to be the back page of the Tiser anymore, is it? Well, in those stages, it was actually the front of the fold of the Tiser, wasn't it? So yeah, that's what's changing. What was so evident by the late 70s, that print was going to be major challenges to print, to be relevant and to be newsworthy and to be worth reading was coming to be. And now we're also getting to the digital era within a decade. Look what it's done to it now. Yeah, you can get a sporting story, and even now television struggles to be first with it because it's going to be out on some digital platform before even a TV network can get space on their airwaves to do it. So things were changing. Yeah, it depends on what you mean by controversial. Do you mean controversial? That's an interesting word. You could either be, so is it telling it as it is? Is that controversial? Is making someone think again about what they've heard somewhere else? Is that controversial? It's an interesting term, controversial. Yeah, look, well, in the end, I can answer it this way. I wasn't going to make anyone waste their time reading something or telling them something I already knew. Now, whether they felt it was controversial, whether they thought, no, that's reason to think again about what I've heard earlier in the day, up to them. Yeah, every club but Norwood. But that's not usually about being controversial. That could be about just putting out a story there that they didn't want out there. Them losing control of their own spin. I did find it interesting. The only club I wasn't banned was Norwood. Even Port banned me. So what's that tell you? You always have sources. You're heavily reliant on them. And you always know someone wants to tell a story because they feel their story hasn't been told by someone else. Yeah, that's always sort of the biggest lesson you learn when you're in journalism is have a contact book, because every phone number is going to be vital to get you another phone number, to get you another story, to get you another view of a story. The more sources you had, the better the story was. Yeah, you love the chase of getting a story no one else had and being able to, I mean, you would sweat through that era of where, bear in mind, you've got no digital at the beginning. You are putting a story in a system and it's going to sit there for possibly 10 hours, maybe even more, and you're hoping no one else gets that story. That's a big sweat moment where you come in and say, those days the Tizer would have a sport roster that began at 2 p.m. If by 7 p.m. your story hasn't been on radio, and KG was breaking a lot, hadn't been on a television news service, that's the enormous victory. Right, we've got this to ourselves. I mean, I used to always love it when editors and sports editors would ask you, have we got this to ourselves? Is this an exclusive? I'd go, well, how would I know what everyone else is working on around this city? But I hope so. I really do hope so. Yeah, and you get to the point at midnight when you know that era was first edition around midnight, that it's gone to the stone. Days of when it was all even hot metal to then bromide, that it got to the stone without anyone else having the story. So that at 6 a.m. there would be newsrooms at every radio station who were going to be quoting, the advertisers are reporting X, Y, Z. That's an amazing, amazing moment to go through. Well, I was already gladdened by the fact that we had a national competition emerging. It was good to be able to go and watch sport that was truly putting its best foot forward nationally. That Port were going to go and seek the licence again, yeah, look, I was delighted by that because I felt this was a football club that deserved more than just a suburban stage. I think they've proven that fact, haven't they? They stand up. I mean, they've had their ups and downs, every club has, but they've proven they belong on a national stage. They bring more to the game by being this proud old South Australian club with a fair bit of heritage and history. I mean, I would have preferred a national competition like the one that was probably envisaged by Merv Agars in 1969 when we had the National Carnival here. And he said, why aren't we doing a national competition? We're in the era of flights. We don't put teams on trains like we used to with state teams. And that vision of just the best teams from all around Australia forming a national competition, we didn't get there for political issues. It was the saddest thing ever that we shot ourselves in the foot by arguing who was to be in charge of this national competition. And now we've got one that's heavily loaded with a Victorian heritage and new teams from all around the country, with the exception of Port Adelaide, that still holds some historic link to the past of South Australian football. So yeah, I was delighted that Port was putting its hand up. But I would have been even happier if it had been a classic case of where we had Port Adelaide and Norwood as the two teams. And then every time they played, it wasn't just about, here's their history since 1997. Here's their history since 1878. Imagine what that would do for making people understand where this game actually began. Didn't happen, sadly. You want to be the best? You want to play among the best? I've never been hung up about nicknames. Like, yeah, Magpies, Power, Magentas. Well, people forget they were Magentas long ago. And look, I remember interviewing, the old Magentas, such as an Angelo Congier, who would tell you about, the torment the players had, their pride in being Magentas. They won a premiership in Magentas, and then someone came up with a black and white jumper. All right, a fair bit of pride came into that one with time, but they were torn up by losing their history as Magentas. I don't get too hung up like some people have about, there's the Magpies gone, but there's a Port Adelaide. This was about having Port Adelaide exist forever. They didn't. I had a look at the Stanley Lewis Premiership Trophy from all those premierships won by Foss Williams and Jeff Motley and John Cale. It's got Port Adelaide on there. Didn't have Magpies. So I don't get hung up about the nickname. So look, if it's a case of whereby, a nickname goes, a jumper becomes assigned to a showdown jumper, fine. The fact is, they're playing to be the best among the best. That's what the football club should be. That's 1999, although I did a bit earlier before I'd left. This was the time where 5AD was covering footy, and I'm trying to remember if it was Dennis Brown, or might have been Dennis Brown, organised for the Tizer Riders to also do updates from SANFL grounds. So you'd have the headsets on and you'd be writing your notes, and then every so often it would be, now we go to Glenelg, go over for an update, and whoever the Tizer Rider was, there were a few of us doing it. But yeah, that was just game day stuff, right? I did a bit of that with 5AD. But by the time I've returned, 1999, I get a phone call from Cam Thompson, who was sports director at 5AA, offering the chance to go on their Saturday sports show. So that's the beginning of radio, which was very, very different to everything that you had learnt about writing, because writing was about thinking about every word you were going to use. Radio is so spontaneous. And then when you're in a room with 2 or 3 others who are just trying to beat you to the answer, you've got to be very, very quick-witted. And yeah, that's 99 from that point onwards. So I do a fair stint at AA, be it Saturday sports show, Sunday roast, and then the opportunity came to go to SEN and do a show there Monday to Friday. So I took that up as well, which was probably good timing for me because things are changing dramatically at the Advertiser at that point. And there's not many of us who are going to survive, so at least it gave me something to do Monday to Friday. Oh, the best part, and always has been, is when the unexpected. And one of the classics is that time when Chris Scott and the famous Geelong delegation came to Adelaide to seek out Travis Boak. And you have a listener who's at Adelaide Airport and sees them and rings in. Oh no, that was a text message, that one. Yeah, that's the other thing. Text messages have changed, people ringing into radio stations. And that's it. It's just that unexpected immediacy, which that's it. You've now on the biggest story of the moment and you're at the start of it and watch it build from there. But also the other bit about talkback radio, the old days of talkback radio where, people did ring rather than send text messages, was just to hear those other points of views. Some of them might have been misguided because of misinformation, but some of them would go, well, you know what? It's a very, very good perspective on something you hadn't thought about because you're seeing it through another lens. But the influence of that sports show that KG's taken to be something that's copied all around Australia from the late 70s. The most important thing about it was people wanted to be on that show because it was their chance to tell their story. That was probably their first opportunity. So you think about what it's like before then. Say you're sitting in a football club and you're about to sack the coach, or you're about to appoint a coach, whichever way you want to do it. You've got to get the story out. It's usually, and I remember how Gordon Schwartz tells the story about when Ken Cunningham was going to be state captain during the World Series era. There was Phil Riding saying, well, this is how we'll do it. We'll announce it in the Advertiser on Monday. We'll do it with Gordon Schwartz. But you never knew what the story would be like at the end. You were relying on how someone was going to write it, someone was going to put a headline on it, what photograph was going to be used. That wasn't the case with KG and his radio show. You would go on at 5 o'clock, you would put your message forward as you've decided how you want to spin it. Again, the trap would be if he came up with a curly question you weren't prepared for. So there was a risk factor with it, but it was the only time you had seemingly control of your story. So it's changing the landscape dramatically. Yeah, that's why a lot of people want to get on live radio. They think they can tell their story without it being edited. It's where the family roots are. It's where most of the family is. Still one of the great destinations to go for. I have my base there. So it's where I get to enjoy life. And the greater lesson you get as time goes on is that time doesn't go forever and there are things to do. I mean, how many stories can you write? How many headlines can you put up with? How many live interviews can you do? And at some point you have to say, look, and I'm sadly watching a lot of my friends get older and struggle with bad fortune of health. And I don't want to be one of those people who gets to an age where I should have done this 10 years earlier, or denied even the chance to think of doing it 10 years earlier. So yeah, look, there's some stage, maybe the John Longmire line, about pass the baton is one that we all should keep in mind. You can't do things forever. Some stage you just have to move along and someone else will do it for you. So yeah, it's a place where I live. It's a good part of the world where you can just get away from things and actually learn about other things that, there's more to life than just a football going through the big sticks to get 6 points. I'm actually more to the point where I want to do more reading than writing. I've got a stack of books that I haven't read. And I probably would prefer to do a bit more editing now than writing. But if I do continue to write, I actually want to write stories of people's stories, tell their stories, help them tell their story. I think I'm tired of chasing the headline that doesn't exist anymore because, you have a look at the cycle now. Something happens. Within 7 seconds, it can be all around the world by social media. Some of it in good ways, some of it in very poor ways. I don't know how you can tell the story now without people saying, I already knew that. That's the big challenge. How do you make someone want to pick up a newspaper or turn on your radio show or watch the TV news? Because everyone's busy. That notion that everyone's time poor. So how do you give them something for them giving you their time? That's the big challenge now. And then there's also that other enormous note. How does this stuff get recorded? Because we know that in 10 years' time, 20 years' time, 100 years' time, someone's going to want to look back. What did happen that day or in that game or in that moment? We go now to the State Library and you can go through those newspaper files and they're papers of record. You can find every goal kicker and behind scorer in any game of football, decade after decade. Pretty hard to do that now. So I do fear for those who are going to want to know where the game was today when it seems to be, everything's just rushed away in social media. Now, where is the paper of record? Where is the note? That's why, even this place as a football history centre is so important, because there is going to be the day someone's going to ask, What did happen in the 100th showdown between Port Adelaide and the Crows? We need to celebrate this moment. How are we going to get the record of what actually happened in that game and before that game? I'm really intrigued as to how that happens from here on. Well, the saddest thing about the growth of a national game is we built the top of the pyramid but didn't understand what was needed underneath. We've been promised for a long time there would be this review of everything under the SANFL. The AFL. Never happened. So we have this national competition that now going to expand with Tasmania. But everything underneath is different leagues, different rule books, different tones of the way in which the game is presented and played. So what is the SANFL today? It's gone from being this tribal competition which had the ability to build players and clubs that could stand up to anyone around the nation. Still look back to what Graham Corns did with that State of Origin era in the 80s to prove the point. South Australia could stand up to anyone. Is it a development league that develops young footballers? Well, no, it probably isn't, because in the end you're still going to have men who want to play beyond draft age at a senior level. So yeah, where does it fit in? And no one's completed the jigsaw puzzle to make it meaningful. Now, wouldn't it be nice if it was as simple as it is somewhere else in the world? If you look at American football, there's a college system, there's a high school system, they're all underneath the big NFL. But the difference there is if you aren't playing NFL, you haven't got a club to play for. So there's a vision somewhere else that doesn't fit us, but we haven't worked ours out. So yeah, we've watched a SANFL transition from tribal to existing under an AFL umbrella. And the big challenge is how to keep it relevant to young people my era was you picked a SANFL club. You wanted to wear a SANFL jumper. What majority of kids now do that? No. They got their heroes off a television screen or off social media with an AFL club. It's an enormous challenge for SANFL clubs. And if they fall away, if grassroots football falls away, what happens to the top of the pyramid? So our leaders are still challenged to come up with this pyramid that looks good, that stands up as well as what the Egyptians did. Because at the moment it doesn't look right. It's challenging. How do you do it? Keep this national competition that's vibrant, that's growing, that's giving us growth in areas where we once thought, you can't do anything north of the Barassi line. That's where the premiership team is now, Brisbane. But how do you stay true to what's underneath it? How do you make the SANFL still be meaningful to young people? I mean, you and I know what it is. We're proud of our existence through kids as SANFL followers. How do you let little Johnny and Jane at 5 and 6 now say, you've got to fall in love with a SANFL club, not just an AFL club? It's a big challenge. How do you keep it so the kids grow up playing SANFL footy? If they don't make the big league, the AFL, they still want to play for Glenelg or Nord or North Adelaide or Westies. And if we're asking that question here in Adelaide, imagine what they're asking in the country districts. How more challenging is it there? But we've got a big job, enormous job to make sure this game is strong at the grassroots. Because we know what the AFL will be. It will have television dollars, it will have marketing dollars, it will always be big. But if you struggle at the very base, good luck.